There were many smart inventions that helped the Allies before and during the Normandy landings. And one of those was a solution to supply the necessary fuel for such a huge operation. The fear of the invasion forces bogging down because of the lack of fuel needed for such a huge motorized force was a real concern, even in the early phases of planning. Operation Overlord, the landing in Normandy, was an unprecedented task, both on the logistic and the strategic sides. For the operation to succeed, the Allies had to gather a landing force unparalleled in size, and this huge army required a vast amount of fuel to keep the war machine in motion. One of the solutions the Allies came up with is known as Operation Pluto, as pipeline underwater transportation of oil, or pipeline under the ocean. So today we will take a deeper look how this plan was conceived, what technical difficulties they faced, and how the operations worked. The first problem to be solved for the invasion was not the transportation through the channel, but how to avoid storing vast amount of fuel and oil near the coast for the invasion forces, where storage facilities could be attacked by the Luftwaffe. As a solution, hundreds of kilometers of pipeline was laid down across England, to carry oil from the storage facilities on the west part to the docks on the south and east coast. This network is known as Government Pipelines and Storage System, or GPSS. These pipelines carried the necessary supply, and this way the Allies could avoid storing large quantities on the eastern parts, where the facilities would have been targets for German bombing raids. During the planning of the Normandy landings, it was estimated that about 60% of the supplies need to be delivered would be fuel and oil for the landing forces. This of course could be done using tanker and cargo ships, but those were subject to air attacks, mines, and unloading could be hampered by bad weather and rough seas. Losing the momentum of the invasion could have been disastrous, so several options were pursued. For the first phase of the operation, the plan was to ship the fuel to Normandy in barrels and jerrycans. It was estimated that 20 million jerrycans will be required for the operation. To supply this, a whole manufacturing plant was shipped to England from America. If you're interested in the history of the jerrycan, I have already made a video on that. See the link in the description or at the end of this video. After the first phase, the plan was to use coastal tankers and larger ocean-going vessels to supply the fuel, which they would pump from the ship to the shore directly. The pipeline developed for this role was known as Tombola. Nonetheless, an underwater pipeline as a backup seemed worthy to explore, as it was safe from enemy attacks, and pumping through the pipeline would reduce the storage needed on the shore, which again would be a target for German forces. In April 1942, Lord Louis Mountbatten and the Secretary for Petroleum, Geoffrey Lloyd, had a meeting where they discussed the possibility of laying a pipeline in the English Channel. Underwater pipes were used before, but only for short distances. They were never tried in a length that was needed for the invasion. The idea was discussed with the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, and their chief designer Clifford Hartley was convinced that the problem could be solved. His basic idea was to use the existing submarine cable technology and modify it to create a pipeline. The work on the pipeline design was done at Siemens Brothers Company in London, who had a lot of experience with undersea cables. This pipeline design then named HACE, short for Hartley Anglo-Iranian Siemens. The operation received the name Pluto and was placed under the command of Captain John F. Hutchings. Between May and August 1942, several tests were conducted with the pipeline to find the best solution which can withstand inside and outside pressure, flexible enough to lay down quickly, and can be manufactured efficiently. The base pipe was 2 inches in diameter and made from lead, surrounded by layers of steel and asphalt tapes, and then steel wires. In December 1942, a larger scale test was conducted, and 30 miles of the pipe was laid down across the Bristol Channel and tested at different pressures and with near bomb drops to see how it holds up. The test showed that the pipes need to be pressurized even during production to prevent distortion, to which the solution was to seal both ends with copper discs, which will burst when the pipeline will be put under full operating pressure. After the trials, it was decided the pipe diameter should be increased to 3 inches, which could reduce the number of pipelines needed, but still the Allies had to manufacture hundreds of miles of pipes. Because of this, even though the trials were successful, the shortage of lead forced the War Department to look into different ideas as well. The fact that even though the pipeline system was just a backup for the main fuel delivery methods, but they were still looking for a second option on the pipes, shows us just how important it was to keep a steady fuel flow for the invasion army. The second option came from Bernard J. Ellis, the chief engineer at Burma Oil Company, who thought a mild steel pipeline could work as well. He teamed up with A.J. Hemmick, and the pipe design was named Hamel from their names. The two different pipes needed separate solutions for laying them down though. The Hayes pipe, being more flexible, could be coiled up inside the cable laying ships. 3 merchant ships were converted for this purpose. But the mild steel Hamel pipe was too rigid to be stored in a ship's hold, so a special delivery tool had to be designed for the pipe. This is probably the image that most people associate with Operation Pluto. The large steel drums, which were 60 feet long and 40 feet in diameter, were designed to be towed by a boat, and each of them were capable of holding 90 miles of pipes. Each of them weighted around 250 tons, and when fully loaded with pipes, their displacement increased to some 1600 tons. They were unofficially named HMS Conundrum 1-6. Operation Pluto was initially planned on the basis that the invasion will take place at Calais, and the pipeline only need to cover around 50 kilometers. But by 1943, the landings were decided to take place in Normandy, and that almost doubled the distance. So now the shortest line was from the Isle of Wight to Cherbourg. But that meant the Allied forces need to capture the port city before the pipes can be put to work. The already working Southampton pipeline was extended to the Isle of Wight, waiting to supply when the time comes. This line was named Bambi. A second pipeline was planned to be laid towards the northern coast of France, between Dungeness and Boulogne, when the Allied forces captured that area. This line was called Dumbo. Dungeness was not near any already built pipelines, so more than 100 kilometers of additional pipes were laid down to connect it to the GPSS network. For more than a year before the invasion, amazing amount of effort was put into making Operation Pluto a reality. A whole factory was built at Tilbury to manufacture and store the Hamel pipes, and by October 1943 they finished the 6 conundrums too. Basically every large cable making machine in the United Kingdom was used to manufacture the Hayes cable, and even some American companies were involved in the manufacturing. Pumping stations were built in the biggest secrecy both on the Isle of Wight and in Dungeness. They were built at night with utmost secrecy and were camouflaged as bungalows, amusement parks, beach villas, or dunes. Finally, in June 1944, the gigantic Allied operation was set into motion. Operation Overlord started, and the combined Allied forces landed on the Normandy beaches. The Bambi line was meant to be operational 75 days after D-Day, and the first pipe to be laid down soon after the capture of Cherbourg. But the laying of the pipeline proved to be much more troublesome than it was anticipated. The first attempt was on 12th of August, but the pipe was caught on the anchor of an escort ship and damaged. 2 days later, another attempt was made, but it was again a failure. On 27th of August, an attempt to lay down a Hamel pipe was stopped right at the start, when the conundrum failed to rotate because of the great amount of barnacles attached to it. A few days later on the second try, the Hamel pipeline broke about halfway to Cherbourg. The first successful pipe was only laid down on 22nd of September, followed by another 5 days later. However, both lines failed on 3rd of October when the pressure was increased on them. Operation Bambi was considered a failure and was terminated the next day. The Dumbo line was more successful on the other hand. Boulogne was captured on 22nd of September, and the first pipeline was laid down without problems and started delivering on 26th of October between Dungeness and Ambleteuse. One by one, 11 Hamel and 6 Hayes pipelines were laid down in this direction by December, and the pipes were extended to Calais to take advantage of the city's railway access. The pipeline at this time delivered 1,300 tons of petrol daily. As the front line was pushed more and more to the east towards Germany, The line was connected to an inland system, which carried the fuel to Antwerp and later to Emmerich. By April 1945, the Dumbo line delivered 4,500 tons of fuel every day. By the time it was shut down in August, the pipeline delivered 820 million liters of petrol. The opinions differ on how successful and useful Operation Pluto was. Some historians state its importance, while others think it wasn't contributed much to the war effort. Operation Pluto's cost was some £4.5 million, and it delivered only 8% of the total fuel supported to the expeditionary forces. It can be argued though that if the events would have been taken different turns, and some ports would have been captured later, the undersea pipeline would have been more important to keep the Allied war machine moving. After all, it was developed as a backup, and though luckily the Allied forces didn't need to rely on it in the end, it was a successful engineering endeavor. After the war between 1946 and 1949, most of the pipelines were salvaged, together with 340,000 liters of petrol still in the pipes. Though the pipes were salvaged, many of the buildings that supported Operation Pluto are still standing, as a memento of this technical feat that helped the Allied armies to liberate Western Europe. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please leave a like, subscribe to my channel, and in the comments let me know if there's any interesting events or vehicles you'd like to see.